The Walking Dead Season 9 premiere remixed a ton of memorable comic storylines into one of the most epic season openers to date. We're gonna break down the best comparisons from this episode to the comics. We're just gonna openly acknowledge that we're doing 901 after we did 902, but look, if Fear the Walking Dead can walk around and just kinda mess around with the timeline, fuck it, let's do it. I'm Woody Tondorf, and this is Panel to Screen. The season picks up nearly a year and a half after the conclusion of all-out war, and a lot has changed. The communities are bigger, Sanctuary has a new leader, and Rick has gone full Old Man Logan on us. Oh, good reference. The comic also skips ahead, but it's 3 years, not a year and a half. Speaking of time jumps, Maggie finally had her baby during the break. Congrats! In both the comic and show, Maggie names her and Glenn's baby Hershel after her father, or German astronomer William Herschel. Who's to know? The only major difference is that comic Hershel is a year and a half older than his show counterpart, but comic Hershel struggles with animal sounds. On to some more new characters! In the premiere, we're introduced to Hilltop members Ken and Marco, fun names, who join our heroes on a supply mission to a museum. Outside of his parents Tammy and Earl, we don't get to know Ken too well because, well, he dies trying to save a fucking horse, as if Ken has never seen the show. The Hilltop holds a funeral for him. Okay, and Gregory uses the occasion to convince Ken's dad to try and kill Maggie in retaliation. You get the idea, it's very Godfather. In the comics, Ken and Marco also join Hilltop during the time jump, but their characters are pretty different. Ken survives a lot longer, and he's not Tammy and Earl's son. And Ken does eventually die, as we all do, dark, but it's at the hand of the Whisperers, not a walker. Marco is mostly the same, for better or worse. Speaking of, Tammy and Earl are also some pretty big comic characters. Personality-wise, the show version of Tammy is spot on. I mean, Brett Butler really nails it. Well done, dude. Her family is another story. In the show, Tammy is married to Earl, who is actually a combination of comic characters Morton, Tammy's husband in the comics, and Earl, the town blacksmith. The Earl we get in the show is basically Morton with a new name and a blacksmithing hobby. In the comics, Tammy and Morton have a son named Brandon and are notorious for calling on Maggie to bring #Justice for Brandon after Carl whooped their son's ass after he and a friend attacked Sophia. Don't fuck with Carl. What's Carl doing in the show? What? Oh, shit. Maggie eventually relents and throws Carl in jail for nearly killing their boy. This parallels their disagreement with Maggie in the episode. On to Rick and Maggie! In the show, Rick visits Hilltop where he and Maggie argue over their so-called obligations to the Saviors. Although there's tension in the comics, this conversation was a lot tamer than the episode. All that stuff with the Saviors and the bridge is unique to the show. As mentioned earlier, Greg uses Ken's death to trick Earl into breaking his sobriety and make an attempt at Maggie's life. Fuck you, Gregory. Unfortunately for Gregory, his plan backfires, mostly because he hired a drunk with no weapons to assassinate Maggie fucking Rhee. I mean, dude, he didn't even have a knife. I mean, what's your fucking plan? Maggie storms into Gregory's trailer and tells him,
"You can't even murder someone, right?"
Damn! Old Greg tries to finish the job, but is again thwarted by Maggie fucking Rhee. Oh, it's dunzo o'clock for you, Gregory. That climactic scene from the show combined two major comic stories into one to make this badass moment come to life. First, Gregory does go to Morton and try to convince him to kill Maggie, but he chickens out. So Gregory takes matters into his own hands and slips Maggie poison, but he gets the dosage wrong and Maggie survives, telling him, "You can't even poison someone right," which was my last Twitter update. The second comic moment the show borrows happens much later in issue 150 when Morton and his bud Vincent attack Rick in a similar cloak and dagger fashion. They did this because Tammy was killed by the Whisperers and Morton hated how slow Rick was taking to retaliate. If you don't know what the Whisperers are, you gon' find out. Morton tries to kill Rick and it fails because, well, you know, Rick bites his throat out and kills him and then Vince runs away because you just saw your buddy get his throat ripped out. You don't hang around for that shit. In the show, Gregory's assassination attempts earned him a spot on the brutal new hit game show, Hangman. He begs for his life and Maggie totally listens to him and has a moment of compassion. Just kidding! Maggie then tells her people she doesn't want to do this, but they ought to know there will be punishment for their crimes. And that crime is don't fuck with Maggie. Gregory also got hung in the comics, but it was much later than in the show. After sitting in jail forever, Gregory eventually gets publicly hung, and Maggie makes a similar speech to her people, encouraging them to work with her, not against her. Also, there's coffee and donuts in the main building. Other than those comic homages, there's a lot that didn't happen in the comics. Rashon and Karzekiel are not couples, sad. The DC Museum mission, the bridge, and Rick's visit to the Sanctuary never happened. And mostly, anything involving show-exclusive characters like Daryl, Jerry, Enid, Anne, Alden, and Cindy were also unique to the show. And that wraps up Panel to Screen for the Season 9 premiere. Like and subscribe to Skybound for more Panel to Screens. I'm Woody Tondorf. See you next time, friends.